Well, it is a pleasure to be here, and I just have enjoyed the whole week, but also this morning and the questions. I'm going to give this brief talk now for about 15 minutes, I think, and we'll take the rest of the time till the witching hour for questions. And the thing I feel the need to address at the end is this issue a winner or a loser? From the standpoint of the critics of evolution, generally you might say, the critics of materialism, or the Christian theists. By the way, you can add Jewish theists, even Islamic theists to that, because the basic issue of creation is common to all. The differences come well after that starting point. Is it a winner for that side, the theistic side, or is it a loser? And most people have thought throughout the 20th century that it's a loser. And the 20th century story has been a story of the ascendancy of the materialist paradigm to dominance. And that's the story of the first half of the 20th century, at least. They say that the 20th century was made by thoughts that came from the 19th, by leading thinkers. And if you ask any intellectual historian what were the most important voices, they were Marx, Freud, Darwin, and Nietzsche. And say Nietzsche proclaimed the death of God, Darwin supplied the murder weapon, Marx explained the consequences for society, and Freud and we're speaking not just of individuals, but of their whole school. Freud and those of his school explained the consequences for the mind. So that, for example, when I went to Harvard College in the 1950s, the ascendant figure was Freud. And that was what, explained what reality was and so on. And when I went to law school, just after that, psychiatry was Freudian psychiatry. And we lawyers were supposed to get with the program, of interpreting everything in Freudian terms. It's very amusing now, because Freud has lost all of his scientific standing, and even the remaining psychoanalysis, whose income is much reduced in many cases, will explain him as a great storyteller, rather than a scientist testing hypotheses. It's greatly changed. Marx has lost his scientific standing, although he has many admirers in certain universities in the West who have secured tenure and so on to talk about changing the lives of others through revolution. And Darwin is still, you see, strong and ascendant. He's the most important of the whole group, because he supplied the platform that made it possible to claim scientific validity, the validity of our most authoritative source of knowledge for the materialist definition of knowledge. So, like a course of Christian thought and apologetics through the 20th century has been damage control in dealing with this. So that you have ideas like theistic evolution, which is basically exactly the same as atheistic evolution, except God is mysteriously and undetectably behind it. And now, obviously it's like that. That's like the teapot around Pluto. You can't prove it false. You can't prove the non-existence of an undetectable entity. But it's not intellectually impressive. And if that's the best that the theists can do, they deserve their marginalization. They deserve to be excluded from the world of knowledge, in my view. So then what you do, you again make the best of the bad situation, is you say, well, we'll deal with the heart and we'll deal with feelings. And we'll meet people where they are. Now, that's not bad. I mean, the heart, the feelings, that's an important part of reality, so I'm not criticizing that. And this is what you see happening in things like Billy Graham rallies, is that you're speaking to the heart, not with an intellectual case, but, to people's needs. I don't mean to show any disrespect for that as an important activity, but, you see, it's leaving something else out, and something that needs to be supplied in some other way. But you have to know how to do it. You have to have confidence that the job can be done. Many people in the Christian academic world who have been critical of what I do, have said he is leading people, the bigger audience he gets, the worse it is, he is leading people in a false direction. It's like a renegade general who leads the army out into the desert, into a hopeless situation, tries to attack an enemy that's so strongly in place that they can't be defeated. And so you're leading the people into destruction, like, that fellow Moses leading him off into the desert and the wilderness and so on. And that this is the worry. And it's a worry that should be raised. You see, I mean, it's a question that's perfectly legitimate that should be asked. I never resent the challenging a question because, that's part of understanding whether you are going in the right direction or not. And so then people will say, well, even if you're right in what you're arguing, you have the whole weight of science against you. You have the editorialists in the New York Times and the Boston Globe, who refuse to take seriously that anything could be wrong with this materialist paradigm. The whole educational system, the TV networks, the museums, all those PBS programs, they're coming out with an 8-part series on PBS, to ratchet up the propaganda, that everybody should believe in the Darwinian theory and understand that those who question it are, by definition, mindless religious fanatics. And that'll be coming as fall on PBS. So isn't this an overwhelming force? No, not at all. Because take a look at another aspect of this situation. The United States is the great scientific leader of the world, largely because we have the money. I mean, I'm not claiming our superior brain power particularly. But a lot of the people, the great scientists are in fact immigrants from Europe or Asia. But the United States is the leading scientific power in the world. And it is also, among developed nations, the one with the strongest Christian movement and worldview still intact. And the Gallup organization has done polls of public opinion over the past several decades. They're basically unchanged in 30 years since they started doing it, despite the enormous barrage of indoctrination and propaganda that's come from the Darwinian establishment funded with your tax money. Now, what the polls show is really fascinating. They ask 3 questions of the sample of, that they've randomly selected. And they ask you which you agree with. And the first question, or statement, there are 3 statements, and you're supposed to say which you agree with. First one is, God created man sometime in the last 10,000 years, pretty much as he is today. Right? And those 44% of the public answers yes to that. Those are put down as strict biblical creationists. Now, the question isn't that good because, you see, it doesn't say anything about a long process of animal evolution. I mean, before that, it's just directed to human beings. And so I don't know how people understand that. And I think that exaggerates the number of real creationists that there are. But it's still a very large number. And anyway, 44%, that's what the poll says. 44% say yes to that. Then the next one is, God created man through a process of evolution over many millions of years that was God-directed. And another like number answer yes to that, over 40%. So you have between 80 and 90% who fit into one of those 2 categories. And the third question is, man evolved over a process of millions of years in an evolutionary process in which God played no part. Now, only about 10% agree with that. It was 12% in the latest one, 9% before that. There's just that little variation. That's the official scientific position. Now, a key group in this is the group in the middle. See, most of those members probably think that they have reconciled science and religion by adopting a position of God-directed evolution. They just say God directed it and it's okay. But from the talk today, and if you've read any of my books, why that isn't really a reconciliation of the 2 positions. It's a superficial, illusory reconciliation. God-guided evolution isn't evolution at all. It's slow creation. As the scientific community uses the term, as it's taught in the schools and everything, evolution is an undirected, unplanned, purposeless process. And that's not accidental. It has to be, because there's nothing around to direct it. You see, in the beginning were the particles, the impersonal laws. If you have an unevolved supernatural mind guiding the process, that's in the beginning was the Word. So it doesn't fit. And the scientific elite knows perfectly well. They interpret these polls just as I do. Only 10% of the people are with them on the issue. They encourage a lot of misunderstanding of this, as the educational process is used here to encourage misunderstanding, because they want to keep that middle group confused. They want them to think that they're on the side of the evolutionists, you see, because otherwise the public opinion situation would be desperate. And so if people get to understand this, if they get to see what is really at issue, they develop a greater understanding. There is an enormous basis of public support out there for opening the question. Even now, 2/3 of the public will tell the Gallup pollsters that they think, that some version of what we call teach the controversy, should be the policy for the schools. And then also for the universities, you say, and the scientific communities, recognize the existence of a controversy and deal with it candidly and honestly. Instead of saying, as they do, there is no controversy to teach, you see, because all real scientists agree on the answer. In the beginning were the particles, volcanoes plus energy equals DNA equals life. That's the stone wall, that's the propaganda. So it's a very vulnerable story, and you see, a key to opening it up is to bring a larger number of people into the discussion. All these people, according to the scientific elite, you shouldn't be listening to this. You shouldn't be here, most of you, because the discussion should only go along among the professional scientists who can be relied upon to share the philosophy and not to question it, and who can be disciplined if they do question it. So you see, that it's got to be kept within that limited affair. And so as I approach this, my whole query, remember, has not been how to answer every question. People ask, are you going to talk about the age of the cosmos and radiometric dating? No, I'm not. I'm going to stick to the point that is essential to opening up the subject so that all the other subjects can be discussed on a level playing field. And that's why I focus on what I do, get people to understand what I do, because I know that once we get that open discussion going on a level playing field, and people get to consider the thesis of books like those I've told you about by Dembski, Nelson, and Behe, and so on that playing field, Darwinism isn't going to last. It just can't survive that kind of an examination. My opponents know that too. See, that's why they can't afford to allow the discussion to get started. That's why it has to be all this ad hominem stuff, the anger, and all the denunciations, all this retelling of the story about how the slow climb from superstition to knowledge has begun with getting God out of the picture, and so on. That will not last in an open public debate. Now, I can, in a way, appreciate why the rulers of science, the metaphysicians of science, those editorial writers at the New York Times and so on, are so frightened of this debate, why they erupted in panic when Kansas challenged the teaching of evolution. I'm trying to tell that story in those moments. It's in chapter 3 of The Wedge of Truth, if you want to read all about it. Why they were panicked by, the first signs of a popular revolt out there in Kansas. Those New York Times editorial writers, Washington Post, Boston Globe editorial writers, the London editorial writers, barely know where Kansas is. To them, it's flyover country. But the prospect of a popular revolt against the officially sponsored creation myth was terrifying. Because, you see, the authority of the mandarins is at stake. Their prestige, their authority as the priesthood. If they could be wrong about something so basic and important, something that they have so vehemently insisted they have proved beyond doubt again and again, questions about other things might come up. You say, the books, once you start auditing the books, you may go to the next volume. And this is what people are concerned about. Now, see, they're also concerned because from the standpoint of those New York Times editorial writers and the others of their class, the group that wants to question this is a group which is known pejoratively as the religious right. And say, these are the types that we should have an un-American activities committee to investigate. And you don't have to talk to the leading figures in scientific elite too much. I get a chance to do this fairly often. You get a drink or two in people and get the conversation going. And you begin to hear that the great fear is the religious right will win elections and Jesse Helms will get control of the science budget. A friend of mine who tells his classes, very frankly, he's a devout atheist and Darwinist, and he tells his classes at Cornell University that Darwinism is atheism, and if you understand it, you will be an atheist. If you think you can reconcile it with theism in any form, you're just not thinking straight. He told me that the president of the National Academy of Sciences some years ago called him in and said, of course you're right. Now would you please shut up? And say, because of the fear of this popular revolt. Now, now you see, no matter what you think about it, if you're worried about the religious right winning elections or whatever, at least you'll understand that that kind of fear has a very distorting effect on the evaluation of scientific evidence. If the theory is your charter of liberty and your charter of authority, you're not going to be objective in viewing evidence that undermines it. You're going to protect it no matter what. And that's what we see going on. Now, you see, I have quite a different faith. I have a faith that trusts the process of open inquiry, that trusts the process of open debate, and it trusts the people to react rationally when they're given a chance to think about things openly. What really is apt, particularly, to cause the irrational result, the result that comes out of anger and leads to excesses, is the sense that they're being kept down, sneered at, and treated as subjects by a ruling elite that won't allow the kind of open discussion that our Constitution is supposed to require. So the way to deal with difficult situations of public opinion is to bring out the considerations, to allow the discussion, to not to try to prevent people from thinking, but to encourage them to think and to think better. And this is why the great emphasis that I'm putting on right now is not really debating evolution. Some of the people like Dembski, Nelson, Wells, and Behe do this so well that I'm ready to get out of the business. And devote my energies to educational projects, particularly at the secondary school and undergraduate level, older teens, 16 through 20, to teach them the worldview issues, to teach them to think, and to teach them to challenge bad ideas, and to develop them as the leaders of Christian thought for the future. People who are capable of going beyond these appeals to the heart, and dealing with the tough intellectual issues. Because that's the challenge, I think, for Christian theism in this coming century. The time when it was understandable to be on defense, to be playing damage control, to be running away from the questions of the mind, to be allowing the universities to be entirely secularized, entirely devoted to agnosticism, is over. Whether or not that was a necessary or unavoidable thing at a time in the past, it isn't the right thing to do now. What we need to do is have people, more and more of them, who can think, who can understand these issues, who are not bamboozled by hidden assumptions and claims of authority, to go by the thousands into the universities and raise the questions. They're already doing that, and they're driving the professors nuts in many of these fields. And so my message to Christian parents in particular and educators is the worst thing that we can do is play defense, is to think that what we've got to do is protect their kids from bad ideas so that they are safe through the time until they leave the home or they leave the protected Christian college environment or whatever it is, so they don't become agnostics until later in life. That's what a lot of what's been doing, isn't it? It's that self-protective thing. It's self-defeating. It doesn't work. It's time to take the ball and go on offense. To be unafraid of ideas, we have better ideas. We can learn to handle all of this stuff. We can learn to make the arguments. In the beginning was the Word. It's as true scientifically as every other way. It's the best possible basis. It's the story, the metaphysical story, the underlying story that makes sense out of science itself. Why are we able to do science? Why are we able to do investigations that uncover profound truths about how the world operates? It's because our minds are created in the minds of the creator of that cosmos. Why don't we do a better job of it? It's because we're not in the right relationship, to that creator. And then that raises problems, that the whole Christian approach in theology is meant to deal with, the problems of sin and salvation, reconciliation to that creator. Think of the Darwinian basis for the scientific inquiring mind. What's the mind for? Reproduction. That's all it's for. It evolved because it was one of those adaptive things that enabled its possessor to reproduce faster than the other. So in that sense, how do you compare the human mind with the mind of the rabbit? A rabbit is superior. It's got its mind on the important thing. The cockroach is better still. And the bacteria, which started the whole thing off, according to the Darwinian story, are the best of all. They have the best, imagine trying to kill all the bacteria, much harder than killing all the people, or even all the rabbits. You see, so the mind, the inquiring mind that sees objective truth is not a Darwinian idea at all. And the most advanced Darwinians understand that. There's no basis for such a belief in such an entity. It's just something that's useful for getting more of whatever you want. And so the basis for understanding the mind, for understanding why we know there's a difference between right and wrong, for understanding that there's a purpose to life beyond just reproducing, comes from a theistic understanding of reality. It's a better idea. We ought to have confidence in it. And when we find that we do, and we advance into the world of knowledge, we'll make gains, and we'll have a wonderful time doing it. Well, that's the talk, so now let's take the last question period. It's got to come up to the microphones right away.
Science is based on reproducibility in the sense that you can do an experiment and do another experiment, and the results should be the same. And so, in a sense, it's inherently naturalistic. It's looking for the laws of nature.
No, it's not. The first sentence is right, and the and so isn't.
Okay. Well, maybe. But if creation is supernatural or special, then as a representative of the scientific thinkers you have backing you, being Nelson, Dembski, and Behe, what do you see as the role of type 1 science in the wedge?
Well, type 1 science is crucial to the wedge and to all investigations. That is, and it's not different from non-science. There's no real dividing line between science and non-science. You see, all investigations attempt to consider the possibilities realistically and to test them against experience. You know, this is when you're dealing with questions of all kinds. It's just rational inquiry. Now, the question is, should rational inquiry stop and be suppressed and turned in an irrational direction if the rational inquiry points to the reality of a creator? That's the way I want to state the question. No, it shouldn't. It shouldn't stop there. And the notion that we can't have rational inquiry or a rationally understandable world if there is a creator is the opposite of the truth. You see, what the materialist wants you to believe is that the world can be rationally comprehensible only if it is the product solely of irrational forces. But if there is a lawgiver, there can no longer be any laws. It's all completely wrong. So, you know, the fact that the world is the product of a mind is the basic idea of theism, and I think that's the essential platform for rational investigation of all kinds. Yeah, well.
My question was, what do you see as science's ability to observe the supernatural?
Well, science is observing the world that's observable. You know, see, the idea that God can't be real because science doesn't observe him directly is the mistake in this. You know, that science constantly and regularly posits the existence of unobservable entities in order to explain the things that are observable. So it is not as if I am proposing something that is something like an abandonment of the principles of good science. It's simply a consistent application of them where it happens to lead to the inferences that people are afraid of, see, because it points to the reality of something they don't want to face. It's simply what scientists do all the time when they're not afraid to follow their own ideal. Yeah.
Some creationists would say that irreducible complexity is not enough. And I think what they're saying is, and I'm sure you probably agree, that when you consider man's sinfulness, once you convince them that there is a creator, they're just as likely to believe in Gaia or some other god of their own making.
Yes, those people are correct. Simply pointing to the existence of intelligent causes in biology is not enough, you see. And in the beginning was the Word does not stop with the first verse, does it? It goes on to a whole lot else, including the proposition that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. So that objection is well taken. If all you do is find causes in biology that are intelligent, you haven't done enough to meet the problems of life. Now, that may be as far as you would want to go as a biologist. Let's say those are issues that are much, about life in general, not about, the investigation of the biologist. That's certainly true. And people have a lot of choices. They can believe in Gaia, as you say. They can believe in pantheism. They can believe Zeus provided the information if they wanted to. See, the mere existence of the information doesn't exclude any of those possibilities. So it's only part of the total picture. People who believe that they have a good reason to believe in the God of the Bible on other grounds will not find that that belief is proved syllogistically by the existence of intelligent causes in biology. No, of course not. But what I say is it really shows a scientific finding, a scientific understanding that's God-friendly rather than God-hostile. But those objectors that you mentioned are quite right that, that's only part of the job, and there's a lot more to be talked about. But I think this is enough for a morning.
Hi, I'm a pastor in a local church around here, and my questions are very practical questions. One question is there a network of guys like yourself that we, those of us who are Christians, can tap into for expertise in areas where we may not be experts? And if so, how do we find out what that network is? And related to that, is the future, scientifically, educationally speaking, going to be within the mainstream, or are Christians more and more going to have to go create their own universities and so forth? I mean, is it so difficult to do it within the mainstream? I have another follow-up question if you can answer.
Yeah, those great questions. And I think this is one of the things we'll want to talk about when we're discussing what things might be done in the future. For now, the experts are in the wedge movement, the intelligent design movement, and they're accessible through the websites. But we're thin on the ground, to tell you the truth. We need a lot more. And I can imagine a real possibility of organizing a network of well-informed people that's local here, in Boston. And that's the kind of thing that we should talk about. I can't do more than that in this answer. But on the other point about doing our own job educationally, see, in my view, all Christian parents, for example, have to do a lot of this job themselves. Now, of course, some people homeschool and all of that. That's the extreme remedy. But, that's not the only solution. I mean, that may be the best solution for many youngsters in many situations to go to the public schools. But the parents have to understand that there has to be an additional teaching. The schools cannot teach them the truth about these subjects and will affirmatively mislead them. Now, it's not necessarily bad for them to hear all of that, you say, if they're prepared to understand that what they're being told is in some cases not reliable, and it comes out of this philosophical dogma and so on. So we have a big educational job to do. But I see it as preparatory to moving into the mainstream and the universities and all of that. We have many people who are doing that are at the leading universities around here that I've been talking about and trying to do that. You see, the universities aren't all bad. They're founded on a wrong definition of knowledge, and it needs to be changed. But there are an awful lot of people in those universities who value knowledge and who value open inquiry. There are ways to open it up. That's, the wedge strategy is a model, for that and how to do it. I go and speak to law professors everywhere, about the free speech, First Amendment aspects of this, and I convince a lot of them because they genuinely believe in those values of open inquiry. So let's work on that. I
have a follow-up question, just quickly. As a pastor, again, I have to try to help curriculum and all that sort of thing with our youth groups and Sunday school. Is there any lead anywhere being done that really does a good job of helping
We are
us?
working on that. We have a number of people. It's coordinated through the Discovery website. If you go to, or if you email me, sort of whatever, I can refer you to some people. Yeah, let's go back. I appreciate your questions, all of them. Let's make them as brief as we can so that I can get at everybody that's up at the microphones.
Much of your thesis is based on the fear of the dialogue, and the notion that fear is a major barrier. That is, many people believe fear that creationism introduced in the educational environment will stifle investigation, open investigation. Much of what you've argued today is just the opposite of that.
It opens it up.
What are some of the avenues that you see? I'm an architect and an urban planner, and a lot of what I do argues the case around issues of city building. And again, one runs into fear, and it's all based on power as to how you make change. In the debate on race, the fear is based on this notion of victim versus perpetrator. And again, it's fear-bounded and it eliminates the possibility of open dialogue. you haven't
Powerful.
really touched on a lot of opportunities that lay people who are not scientists can begin to open this dialogue up and begin to have this dialogue in a way that doesn't let fear dominate and shut things down.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that seems to be one area of work. And you've touched on it today, but it seems to be something that would be really
I think that's right. I mean, I certainly accept that situation. I don't know how much I can say in response to that today, but certainly that's right. And, you know, I guess I'll just say this. Best effort to answer. It really may not meet your concern specifically enough. But one of the things, when I say in the beginning was the Word is true, you know, the Word is not a concept in the minds of people. It's a living entity. You know, everything that was created through Him, nothing was created without Him. It's a person. It is a personal knowledge, a person who can speak for himself. And what I find, what I believe, is that when you get people coming around that common understanding, the Word can speak for itself if it is freed to do so. You know, it will do so. And that this is the starting point. You want to get away from the other kind of ideology that says the world is divided into victims and oppressors. You know, and the important thing is to get the victims in a position of power where they can start to do some oppressing. You know, that's political correctness. That's what works in the universities. We need to challenge those things at the roots and free the spirit. And when people get encouraged by that, wonderful things happen. Yes.
My name is Dan Crawford. Professor Johnson, your writings have emphasized that what has emerged since Darwin is a real conflict between science and religion, and particularly evolutionary theory and religious belief. That Darwin's theory has serious implications for the Christian's conception of God's goodness, sovereignty, and saving providence. In the face of this opposition, you've argued that we must hold on to our theological theistic beliefs and throw out science, throw out evolution. I'm not prepared to do this, although I do think that evolutionary theory needs to undergo significant revision. In light of the opposition I've described, I'd like to hear what you think about another alternative response, the possibility that evolution may force theists to revise their conception of God and to begin to put some limitations on God's goodness or sovereignty. Mm-hmm. The idea is that theists may have to give some if there is ever going to be a reconciliation with science.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a good question, and I think the leading example of that kind of doing would be what's called process theology. Maybe that's what you had in mind. You know, that sort of says, well, we're going to limit God's sovereignty, His power. That helps explain the problem of evil. He's not powerful enough to prevent it, or He has to rely on the evolutionary process. Maybe God is evolving along with the process. There's a lot of good, a lot of academic thinking stemming from Charles Hartshorne and others, which has proposed this. Now, you see, what I would say in answer to that is that most of the people who have gone in that way have thought that because the theory of evolution and its naturalistic components, its naturalistic mechanism comes with the authority of science, it must be true, or at least unchallengeable. And that's what I would urge them to rethink. Now, I think I'm open to people considering whatever alternative answers that they want. In a way, I don't worry about what your answer is. It's either of anybody's. I don't worry about what my answers are to some of these questions, because I believe that once we get an open inquiry on a level playing field, the truth will be able to speak for itself. And I don't intend to attempt to steer that discussion so that it comes out to conclusions that I prefer. And of course, I couldn't do it even if I wanted to. So it's easy to give up that ambition. So what I would say to such people is keep your mind open to the possibility that the things that you have taken for granted from science just aren't true. You can be doubtful of it. I mean, you can hold your reservations, but assist us in getting that open inquiry on a level playing field, because you've said, too, that the theory needs to be re-examined in some respects. And be prepared for some surprises when that happens. I say, but I respect people who are not prepared to make exactly the moves I have, and have reservations about that and want to think of other alternatives. But so long as we get that opening of the whole subject, I'll have what I think is most necessary. So thank you for that too.
My basic question is a follow-up on something you were leading to earlier. Are there textbooks basically that will address the controversy between evolution and creationism that could be used in schools?
Are there textbooks? Well, there's one effort, an early effort, called Of Pandas and People, which has been used as a supplementary text in biology classes. You can find out all about that at the websites that I cited. And it's going to be revised. I think it needs to be improved because it really got in its present form before a lot of the things had happened that we've developed. But it was a good start. It's very controversial. You see, the scientific educators go all out to prevent its use in classrooms. So we have to keep secret the names of teachers who use it to supplement the biology books and so on. But it is a book that's available, and many teachers find is very helpful. There's a book that's just been translated from the German by that's by a man named Scherer and others from Germany. That's a good college book. I think the translation's been completed now. You might find out about that at the Discovery website too. Basically, I think what people have to do for now is to rely on the books that I've cited, sort of on the knowledge, and just bring up the basic problems with the young people. We need to do much more textbook writing and much more writing of materials for homeschoolers, for Sunday schools, and so on. And as I say, that's what's turning into my major interest, because I see it as the thing that needs to be done. We're behind on it. But that's what I can tell you. Yes, yes.
I have a couple quick questions. You've been talking about the Christian view of creation. So I was wondering, there are lots of other religions in the world that have different views of creation. How do you deal with their explanations? Are they wrong? I mean, how would you approach that?
Well, now, one has to answer that question at different levels. You'll remember that the man over here, said there's this criticism that finding intelligent causes, isn't enough because it leaves all the options open. And so one part of my answer to that question is that in terms of the intelligent design argument in biology, the wedge strategy and so on, those issues aren't answered. They're all left open. There are intelligent causes, and different religious traditions could offer different explanations for that. It's Allah. It's Krishna coming to consciousness or whatever. You see, it's the God of the Bible and so on. But the evidence of intelligent causes in biology would not answer any of those questions. It would be left to another subject. Now, as to what I think about it, of course, I'm an evangelical Christian, and let's say I am reciting the prologue to the Gospel of John with great enthusiasm and endorsement. Now, this is not a session about why that is true as opposed to the alternatives, because it would require an entirely different session. But let me just say that my answer to the problems of the different religions and so on is very similar to my answer to the scientific questions and all. The truth that I am speaking of, the word, is something that can speak for itself when it's given a chance to do so. One of the things that it is awfully encouraging to me is that, it is the Christian gospel, it is the Christian account of reality that has been subject to an enormous debunking and deconstructive effort by all of the leading intellectuals of the society for the last 200 years. Not only since Darwin, but before that. Besides biological evolution, there's been the higher criticism of the Bible, from the German universities and all, which is basically just evolutionary naturalism applied to that subject. It's the same thing all over again, the same thinking patterns, as many people are beginning to realize. So there's been this enormous effort to discredit the God of the Bible and to get him out of reality in all sorts of fields and from all sorts of perspectives. And what we see at the end of this process, the faith is coming alive for renewal, and it is the scientific materialism and naturalism that's feeling the pressure. You see, so we have nothing to fear from open inquiry with all the issues on the table. None of our documents are hidden away in a safe. People who try to deconstruct the Bible are not murdered, unlike people who deconstruct other sacred documents. So we have nothing to fear from open inquiry and from open dialogue. A religion which, for example, murders people who try to convert to another one is not really a competitor, the field of open consideration. So all we need to do is put all those issues on the table, and I think the gospel of Christ will do very well.
I just have one other quick question, totally unrelated. So a lot of times when scientists study things, they use things they call model organisms, like mice or bacteria or all the different things you were naming. And one of the assumptions is that those things do have things in common because of evolution. Like you might, if you were studying cancer, you might study in a mouse. So how do you deal with the fact that things aren't studied in people for a lot of
I mean that there are
cases?
similar genes in mouse and people, or various similarities and so on. Well, I love to tell the story of a professor at Ohio State who wrote a book published by Stanford University Press called Evolution and the Myth of Creationism. And she's going to show evolution is true, it's universal, it's completely reliable. And he said, I'll illustrate to you how everything evolves and why, of course, you'll believe in evolution. Think about the evolution of the Corvette automobile. You say you start with the original Corvette and then the Stingray and then all these other models, and they're obviously variations on a common design plan, and they all have common parts. So you see that's evolution. No, that's common design. You say. And in fact, designers always use variations on a common design, always use common parts. Airplanes, speedboats, and racing automobiles all have starters. They all have a great deal of common parts because they have common functions. It would be absolutely to be expected that different kinds of animals would have common parts because they all have the job, just like you have to get energy out of gasoline to run a speedboat or a car, you have to get energy out of the same biochemical processes to have a being. So common parts or commonalities does not indicate father to son to daughter to granddaughter descent. It's not evidence of that. You'd have to have other evidence to decide that. So those are reflections of the common design from our view. Thank you. Yeah.
Some of the themes that you touched on that were predominant is natural law, complexity, and intelligence. My background is physics, and in physics there's a very famous theoretical physicist, John Archibald Wheeler, one of the co-founders of the theory of the black hole, whose metaphysical writings in the later years of his life had to do with this quantum mechanical relationship between observer and events that is closer linked than in classical mechanics, so that he came up with this system of thought that says the universe could not exist if there wasn't intelligence to appreciate it or observe it. Have you given much thought to that or examined that? Does that fall into your...
Yeah, well, I think that some of the things that have come out of the quantum revolution and all of that have been helpful along the lines of questioning this simple materialistic, kind of paradigm that the Darwinists have. And physicists are really quite different from biologists in this respect. They're often kind of mystical. And Wheeler, for example, himself is one of these who floated the many worlds interpretation of the quantum events, so that there are a multitude of universes and we're only one of them. And that helps to explain how things can happen and so on. And all I would say is that what those tend to do is to point out that, there's a lot of different philosophical answers to questions. And it's a matter of philosophy, and they have tended to discredit the idea that there is something like a scientific demonstration of the truth of materialism. And they've also brought the observer back into the picture, and the idea of the personal knowledge that you can't really have a world without people to observe it, which is not creationism, but it's friendly to the idea of creation. And so I welcome all of that. It's just a sort of part of the picture. Yeah. And we do think about that a lot. Now, let me just say one more thing about the physicists and the astronomers and so on. One of the reasons why cosmologists in particular can be a little more relaxed about creation is because they're thinking about, how the Big Bang was set off in the first place, and the setting of the initial conditions and all of that. But they're then imagining that natural laws governed everything that happened after the ultimate beginning. See, now that's not too threatening, because it has God acting only at the beginning, and thereafter nature is in control of itself and God is out of the picture. But when you're talking about intelligent causes in biology, you're getting too close to home. And that's why the idea is so ferociously resisted by biologists, whereas physicists and cosmologists are more relaxed.
One thing you just said made me think of another thing I've been thinking of the last few years. We hear a lot about chaos theory, and I've studied this, and it has a lot to do with complexity. In complex systems, you often have something called emergent properties that can be seen from very simple equations.
Yeah. But they don't write complex genetic information.
Laws, like you were saying, being repeated over and over and over again, can take on an emergent property that's very different than the underlying simple repetitive law. In chaos, as it's framed by the mathematicians, it's different than randomness. You have order, but it emerges different than just simple structured order. In the writing of Genesis, where we see in Genesis chapter 1, basically the universe being created out of nothingness, in the Hebrew, and it's even closer in the Spanish translation, one can interpret it to mean out of chaos, order, the universe in order was created.
Yeah. Well, let me just say, I'm not going to go very far with this because I can see that going on another hour. But the idea that chaos has shown how complex, specified information can get written by irrational process is not experimentally valid. What chaos really basically shows is you often can't predict what's going to come from small causes, and that's true. There are such things as emergent properties. I'll leave the rest of this to Demsky. But no, they don't write encyclopedias that way and computer programs.
Mathematical definition between chaos and randomness. I just want to point that out.
Okay.
In our common language, they're synonymous.
Yeah. Okay.
That's what
sure.
I was just trying to say.
Okay.
Okay. I have a comment and then I have a question. I'm a middle school science teacher and I also teach English as a second language. And I had one of my students who's from Albania tell me, why do you not talk about God when you talk about making things? It blew his mind because he came from Albania. That was a part of science class, was God. So I just thought that was very interesting. And also, you were saying before that you should teach worldviews to students, and not to protect them, just to be able to know how to think. How exactly do you go about that? Can you give me a lesson plan? Like, what would I do? And also not to get in trouble with the law.
Yeah. Well, that's great. That's really our good question. The first thing about the Albanian and all of that, one of the amusing things is we hear all the time from people behind, the former communist countries. You'll find them talking frankly about all sorts of God issues and public education, so it wouldn't be allowed for a moment in America. It happens in communist China. With all the stories of Christian persecution. So I hear a lot of other stories, about very frank teaching about the role of God in creation and so on. It's perfectly allowed. And I know I published in the Wall Street Journal this article in which I mentioned a quote from a Chinese paleontologist who had lost his belief in Darwinism because they're discovering so many fundamentally different things, with no evolutionary history. And he remarked to an audience in Berkeley that he said, well, in China, we can't criticize the government, but we can criticize Darwin. In America, you can criticize the government, but you can't criticize Darwin. And so we've got to do this. We've got to do it anyway. There's an old song, Mama don't allow no trombone playing around here. We're going to play the trombone anyhow. We've got to play that trombone anyhow. And do that. Now, on what you can do, actually, teachers, particularly at that kind of middle school level and some below the high school level, have an awful lot of freedom generally and can do a lot of things. And I think, one of the things that you can do, it's just very simple stuff, is if you're showing kids something like, mosquitoes become resistant to insecticide, let's say. And this is why DDT doesn't work. It's a basic scientific thing, and they call that evolution. But some people say that explains how you get mosquitoes in the first place, and people for the mosquitoes to bite. What do you think about that, kids? Does that sound like that's inadequate? Would you need something else? Just get them thinking that way a bit. You don't have to go the whole trip. I think basically if you introduce the idea of critical, skeptical thinking in some small way that's appropriate to the age group, you're on the right start and doing a good job. And so that's what I'd suggest for now. And you don't get into trouble for doing this kind of thing unless it turns out that unluckily you have the president of the local atheist club's son or daughter in your class. And then they said, Daddy, did you want to hear what we're being taught? And he goes off the deep end. He calls the ACLU, and they bring in lawyers to threaten a lawsuit. You see, that the district can't afford to defend, and they get newspaper editorials. That's when teachers get in trouble. Otherwise, the general experience is you can do a whole lot of this kind of thing, just introducing critical thinking, and you know, it'll go down just fine. Yes, a final question here.
Yeah, I'll labor to be brief, but I'm afraid I'll become obscure, so I'll be fairly quickly.
A lot of people are.
I pride myself as a social scientist, but from what I've heard today, I have trouble using the word in either form, science, with the social part. But there are two elements I've always felt important. One is rationality, and the second is objectivity. I see both of them undermined in the social sciences, double what you've said today about the natural sciences. I had a recent...
This is the last question.
Yeah, this is it.
Yeah.
I had a recent meeting with some criminologist and a fellow who was the predominant anti-capital punishment person in Florida, who said to me, quote unquote, I said, I understand the morality of the issue and you're taking the right side, but if your logic, if your research, if everything you do leads that capital punishment is indeed a deterrent, what then would your stance be? And his answer would be, I would sit on that research. So I guess my question is, what do you tell us social scientists were to do with objectivity and rationality, what's left of it?
Well, social science, you know, as I've said, there isn't any sheer dividing line between science and non-science. And an example of social science is it's not quite like physics, but you know, it has scientific methods, and you try to view the data objectively. Now, whether you can measure a deterrent effect or not is something you can approach objectively. And what I always define as the essence of scientific thinking is the view that, this is the last question I'm taking, we're going to be over after that. What I define as scientific thinking is the ability to understand that there's a difference between what you want to believe and what the data are telling you. Now, some people in social science, I think this is what your question implies, don't respect that. You know, and so that they might be so fervently against the death penalty, to use the example you gave, but it could be anything else, that they are unwilling to report data or try to find some way to escape data that says that the death penalty has a deterrent effect. And this is wrong. This is a violation of professional norms, and it should be criticized. They should be objective in that sort of thing. Now, obviously, those findings don't settle the issue of whether we should have a death penalty or not. You could well say there are moral imperatives that would say that we shouldn't have it, you know, even if it has a deterrent effect. But to say we shouldn't have it even if it has a deterrent effect and therefore it can't possibly have a deterrent effect is illogical thinking. And, you know, so I mean, I guess that's not obscure at all, is that professionals of all kinds have to cultivate a certain professional objectivity. You see, I mean, if a lawyer is talking to a client, you see, the client wants the result, wants to be acquitted. And on the one hand, the lawyer has to identify with the client. You know, there's that personal thing. But the lawyer has to be objective. You know, you're going to be convicted. You know, or you know, this is what the evidentiary thing is. You should consider a plea bargain. You know, you have to make objective judgments about that sort of thing. So that's always part of rational thinking, is a professional you know, objectivity in findings. But then, of course, that doesn't rule out the heart either. And it doesn't rule out moral principles that may trump the objective findings when they're honestly, you know, stated rather than dishonestly put into the investigative process. So in a way, it's the same problem we deal everywhere, that what tends to happen is that this is the great temptation of the mind. Is to say, well, I really want to believe this is true. You know, I really want to believe science can solve everything. I really want to believe we can take over the creative power of the universe. I really want to believe that there isn't an obnoxious oppressor God who would try to, you know, limit my moral sexual freedom, you know, or whatever. And so the peppered moth experiment demonstrates that natural selection is our creator. Right? That's what's happened. And that critique is what we have to make. And I just want to say that those of you who've come to listen to this, and especially those who've asked questions of various types and that have helped the discussion along, have contributed mightily to achieving the goal of taking an important truth that has been shoved under the rug, that has been not allowed an expression, that has been not allowed to be considered, putting it on the mainstream table for discussion. And I assure you, in the end, when we give the truth a chance to speak for itself, it will do so. Thank you all.